get a little closer to you here. Let's get closer first, shall we? Okay, so before I start getting the complaints that you can't hear me and everything else, let's just try to hang in here, try to listen to me. Try to speak as loud as possible. If you cannot hear me, don't stay quiet and tell me you can't hear me, and we will correct you. Right? So, if you cannot hear me, tell me, and we will take measures to address that. Okay? So, meanwhile, because if we don't keep this data vision in an effective system going, we're very, very uncomfortable for all of us, as is really turns into the sauna. So, let us proceed then with the topic. So, what do we want to talk about today? We want to talk about services, right? Services. So how important are services, right? By way of motivating the class, sort of setting our bases. How important are services? Well, I argue that services are critically important, right? Services have a huge role to play in the overall functioning of our economy. So it has a huge overarching macroeconomic economic services. And so therefore, when we recognize that, we also recognize another thing, and that is not only are services big now, but they were big and they are growing, getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and they are economically becoming more and more impactful. So this we recognize. So therefore, as potential graduates, as potential folks who might be working in the marketing domain or in the business domain, but you lose to understand that. You need to understand that services have a huge impact. And so therefore, you need to understand how services work, what they are, what they're all about, and understand the overall marketing impact of services. So that really is the underpinning motivational kind of point that I would bring out at this point. And furthermore, as we proceed into today's session, I resist the temptation of getting ahead of myself right now, because we have some other pieces of conveying which will further reinforce the point that we're making. So therefore, when we talk about services, we recognize then that where are we in our overall strategic map for the course? We are right down over here, right? We're talking about a product that's consistent with the point that I make at virtually every class. What do I always say? We use this word product in this context. We recognize then that a product can be a good and or a service. So we recognize that. Right? When we invest money in, let's say, that's my favorite product. Let's say I invest money in financial instrument, such as, say, we have, let's say, GIC, or let's say, whatever equivalent of GIC, right? That is the product, my personal product. And it is a financial product. So happens that essentially it's service. A mortgage with a mortgage product. We don't use the product. So therefore we recognize that. So that's where we are today. And by the way, it's the last time. Next class, we have a wrap up. But that's what we want to talk about today. So more specifically then, like everything else, we start off talking about exactly what services are, what the characteristics of services, how to understand what services are all about. We'll talk about amendment. That, if anything, is consistent with what I tell you all the time. What is my mantra here with regard to measurement? As I always say, if we do it,
we have to measure it.
If we do it, we must
measure it.
Right. Say that with me.
If we do it, we must measure it.
Absolutely, absolutely, very good. So, yeah, we must measure it. So, like everything else, we want to think about it. Great. We want to think about how we measure it. Not only is it important to have, a broad, sort of, corporate organizational role, it is also pretty important at the level of operation. Right? Even if we were to open up our own business, it's still critically important that we understand how those things work. That makes sense to you? So, this is the kind of thinking we want to bring to bear. And accordingly, we'll talk about some strategic aspects, and then accordingly, we'll draw into looking at some of the remaining P's, right? 4P, talking about the product sources right now, which leaves then three other P's that we can think about. So we will consider them the service implications associated with the P. So that's what we want to talk about. So, as I had mentioned to you before, circling back to the initial point that I made, we recognize that services are big, they were big, and they are big now, and they are highly impactful and getting even bigger moving forward. You see, depending on the numbers that we look at, we see that as a percentage of GDP, it is steadily growing. I mean, we see, depending on the numbers we look at, I would suggest right now, as we speak, services contribute, this way back, over 80%, I would say right now, overall, is derived from services. Big numbers, right? To me, that's kind of somewhat overwhelming, but really swimming at that momentarily. So it's big. We also recognize that, almost three-quarters or more, three-quarters of our workforce for the country is important within the domain of services. So these are big. These are very, very important things. So yeah, I mean, when we look at our overall economy, you see that there are two major sectors, if you will, of our economy. One is more manufacturing, goods manufacturing, and the other one is services, product. And so therefore, when you look at that way, you say, it starts to make sense, right? The numbers that I cited here to sort of convey the magnitude and the impact. So we have this kind of function. Furthermore, further enhancing the overall credibility of this point is that, for many goods, we also, for most goods, we also have a service component associated with most goods. So yeah, figure we think of any good really of having a service component sort of layered on to that good. Is there a service component associated with a tube of toothpaste? Tube of toothpaste? The answer is sure. Yeah, absolutely there is. What is it? Well, when you look at a 1-800 number on a tube of toothpaste for further information on the product, call this 1-800 number on the tube of toothpaste. What is that? That is a service component associated with that good. So the point here is that most goods have a service component associated with it. So this is key. Right? Furthermore, we also see that, from a corporate perspective, we also see another major trend occurring within corporate space, and that is this, that services are progressively accounting for more and more major corporate revenues, more major corporate revenue streams. We see, for example, 40% of GE's revenues, for example, are derived from services. You see over 60% of, let me rephrase it. We see significant portions of major revenue streams from the corporate world derived from services. GE being a case in point. Another example is IBM, for example. IBM has over the last few years really strategically reoriented themselves such that now they are, I would argue, primarily a service-rendered kind of a company. I mean, when I was your age, 4 or 5 years ago, GDP was, GE was basically a hardware company. We take the mainframe computer, and that's what I was looking. Now we sort of switched to more of a software consulting. So you see that in the order of 40 to 60% of their revenue stream is derived from services. So this is very big, right? It's the part. So like I said, when we talk about services, primarily what are we talking about? Well, we will talk about several characteristics of how to understand what we're talking about. But fundamentally, services are all about the holistic and offerings offer consumers and customers in return for some kind of so services then can form the basis of that. So that's fundamentally what services are about. Instead, but just make the point that from not macroeconomic furthermore, they are growing and growing. So when we talk about the stocks, one of the things that always strikes me is that, when I cite some of these numbers, these proportions, it always sort of gives a little bit of an really? And then it's not, and I think, okay, well, what are some of the industries that we're helping? We're talking about a multitude of industries. Let's read off the list of industries. Allow me sort of. No, finance, banking, yeah, what else? What else? Banking, IT, what else? Healthcare, medical care, dental, insurance, other investment, consulting, how about this? Education, government, what else? What else?
Training,
so we have all of these industries that really are succeeding under this umbrella of services. So it is big. So therefore, when we recognize all of these services that are succeeding under a broad umbrella of services, so therefore, we can look at what services are really all about. Now, one of the things here that we like to talk about is various frameworks to help us understand. And in marketing, like I told you before, that we love our frameworks. Marketers love frameworks. They want to educate when we use it. We can tap on these frameworks. It makes us feel good. It enables us to make sense of the work. Right? So when we talk about services, it is it's and so therefore we have some major frameworks here that we can address. One is what we call the 4I framework. And when we talk about the 4I framework, we see the 4 I's right there. Intangibility, consistency, acceptability, and predictability. These are major, very important. And what services are all about. So we are going to put that on the side burner for now, and it's sort of have to talk about. The next framework that we often use is what we call the 8P framework. Sometimes we see it as a 7P, sometimes we see it as a 9P, and very often we see it as an 8P. But generally speaking, so when we talk about an 8P framework, what do we have? We have our usual 4P framework, and we should have 4 different P's that are relevant and we see them before. So the first one that we see here is people. So people. So within the service domain here, people have a very special role to play. Very special role to play. People are central to services. Our services dispense. And so we recognize that. And furthermore, it also allows us to recognize the very special and important role that is played by the service provider. Yes, service provider has a very, very special role in service. And why is that? Because it is the service provider that physically delivers the service to the customer. So the SBA will never work on the service. And furthermore, at that time, the service provider really becomes the face of the delivery. So we went up to the university companies, distribution, and the medical visit, and then the next receptionist. At one point, providing services, she is essentially the face of the entire organization. So this is a very important role. Very important role. So, as we sort of think of that, what does that mean? Well, that means then that from an HR perspective, HR marketing perspective, I guess we call it HR marketing, we need to look after our people. You know, as a former CEO of Marriott, before it's in this case, we look after our people in order for them to look after our customers. So people occupy a very, very prominent role, and the service provider has that very prominent role. And by the way, when we talk about people, when we talk about internal marketing, what is that all about? Internal marketing, which is really big in services. Really, the word internal marketing is all about essentially getting your own people, your own employees, to buy into and support what you are trying to do. It starts internally. So it starts internally, and so therefore we need to initially focus on marketing at the top, our internal, or we can never hope to do it. So that is the key thing. Internal marketing. So we will talk more about that. Furthermore, we see another key, and that is physical evidence. The physical evidence is pretty important for services and service by physical evidence. So what do we mean by that? Well, let me set it up this way. When we look at services, we recognize that one of the major characteristics, and we'll talk more about this momentarily, of services is things. So therefore, in a modern consumer do, it probably makes sense to have information about something that is fundamentally confidential. You will look to available pieces of information. And largely that could come by way of physical evidence that is provided. So, what does that mean, physical evidence? Well, how about physical evidence like this? You walk into an MD's office or a dental office, and what do you see on the wall? You see their certificates, you see their qualifications, you see their certificate of membership, physicians and surgeons. On the law side, you see certificates saying what member of the Law Society of Canada, for example, right? Professional memberships, degrees, all that kind of thing. What is that? Physical evidence. If you are an architect or a photographer, what do you want to do? What must you do for your customer? You need to provide a portfolio of past work. Photography, design, etc. What is that? Physical evidence. If you go online and you are marketing, you run, let's say, this example, let's say a lawn care company, what should you do here? If you set up a website like that, you would want to provide physical evidence on your website, such as
Pictures.
testimonials, pictures. Testimonials are very important. Testimonials, pictures, little videos, all that kind of, that's what you want to provide. That physical evidence of the service to the consumer. The physical evidence. And that would be another thing that we talk about. Why is it? Because it's all about that intangible abuse. We need to from a market. So furthermore, we also see process. So process is very important. We'll talk more about the process here. But when we talk about the process, it's all about sort of the accountability associated with the deliverer of the service and the actual service. That basically one and the same service provider and service all the time. So you recognize that. You also recognize that there are important aspects of the consumer perspective associated with the overall process of delivery of the service. You know, in other words, how fast can consumers acquire the benefits of the service? All of the process. You know, are they kept waiting? Are they jerked around on the phone when they're trying to talk to someone? All these aspects play into the process by which the service is designed and delivered to the customer. So process is an important thing. So if I, for example, invest in a mutual fund, how fast can it be until I receive the benefits of that investment? How fast? Still, however, if I go to see a dentist, how fast will I receive the benefits of that? And productivity is important to talk about that. So, the key characteristic of services is really the mother of all characteristics, as I say, which is as I will say to you again, fundamentally one of the major strategic challenges for us as service marketers essentially is how to tangibilize something that is fundamentally intangible. That is a key thing. So again, when we talk about intangibility, let's say again, what do we touch on? The things that we just cannot do those right? You can't pick it up, you can't touch it, you can't put it on the shelf, you can't inventory it for the future sales and goods. That doesn't mean to say that the word intangible doesn't apply here. The word absolutely does apply. So, anyways, intangibility is important. Furthermore, another key word is what we call inconsistency. And when we use the word inconsistency here, we are capturing the heterogeneous nature of services. That is the non-standardized kind of aspect associated with services. Namely that, the service essentially changes every time that it is delivered. The service changes every time you have a different service provider providing the service. And so largely, the provision of the service and the delivery of the service depends on the role of a person, which we call a deaf people, it depends on the person, it depends on the knowledge, the experience, and the mood. Mood is an important thing. It depends on the mood of the service provider. So yeah, when you go to get a haircut, hopefully, you hope that your barber is in a good mood, right? The mood has to be full. So yeah, it varies every time it is delivered. And that sort of captures this notion of non-standardization, of inconsistency. So that's the second major characteristic of services. The third major characteristic that is important here is what we call inseparability. And when we use the word inseparability, here we're capturing the notion that you cannot separate the service provider from the service. They're essentially one and the same. You can't separate that. Furthermore, you need to have the service provider in place in order to render the service and acquire that service. And also, inseparability speaks to another important notion, and that is that you cannot separate consumption of the service from the delivery of the service. You can't separate it. So in other words, there is simultaneous consumption with the acquiring of the service. So those are two key things associated with services. So simultaneous delivery with consumption. And furthermore, brings us then to the last major line here, and that's what we call inventory. So yes, even though we're talking about intangible products here, we still recognize that the word inventory is important. So inventory means essentially on this means excess capacity. It means capacity management. That's what inventory is meant here. So in other words, when we talk, let me give you an example. If you walk into Quincy and someone else exactly what I like to do over here, and that is that if you walk into a dental office and you see 4 dentists sitting there reading a magazine, what are they doing? They're not dispensing any service. Exactly. That means that there is excess capacity. They're not doing it. They're sitting there not doing it. Rendering any kind of service. What is that? Excess capacity. What is that? Excess inventory. That is what is meant by inventory in this service. So that's what we mean by that. So those are 4 major characteristics that we use to help us understand the nature of services. So that is. So, as we recognize these major characteristics, then, we can also go into this and understand a bit more detail also. Whereby we recognize that whenever we, as consumers, for example, evaluate a product, we can evaluate a product in a number of ways. One major way by which we can evaluate a product is by looking at the product features or attributes. Again, a consistent theme that I've said almost every class. So, if we recognize that, we can look into the different types of attributes. So here, we recognize that there are different types of attributes. Some of which are more relevant to service purchase, some are more relevant to goods purchase. So, recognizing that, then, we suggest that there are 3 major categories, if you will, of public attributes. First one is what we call search attributes. Search attributes are all about examining those attributes that you can search out. So in other words, there are some products that consumers can evaluate, try out prior to purchase, prior to consumption. So if I want to buy a new shirt, I can try it on. If I want to buy a new pair of pants or shoes, I can try that on. Why? Search that, I can search it. If I want to try a pen or a new card, I can search it up before I purchase it or consume it. Right? Why? I can search attributes. So these are attributes you can search out and evaluate prior to purchase. You also have another category of attributes that we call experience attributes. And these are attributes that you can only really assess after you experience them. So, in other words, if you go to a restaurant, can you really evaluate the restaurant before purchasing it? Can you really evaluate a holiday resort before experiencing it? Can you evaluate holiday resort or a flight before purchasing it and consuming it? No. You have to experience it before you can evaluate it, right? So these are products, services that are high in experience attributes. And then we have the third category of attributes that we talk about, and that is what we call credence attributes. And when we talk about credence attributes, it's those attributes that you can't evaluate even after you purchase it, even after you experience it, even after you consume it. Those are what we call credence attributes. In other words, credence, credibility, even after purchase, after consumption, you still can't evaluate it. So therefore, we revert to the credibility associated with the service provider. So you get a medical diagnosis, or the technician says something about your car and some part being broken, we don't have the wherewithal in order to evaluate it, right? So we have to rely on the credibility of the service provider. And that's what we call credence attributes. So when we look at the overall continuum of products, from goods, hardcore goods, ranging all the way up to hardcore services, we have a continuum that looks somewhat like this, right? And you see this in your textbook, and you see this kind of thing appears in a lot of sources, various shapes and sizes. Basically, all it is the continuum of products. So, you see goods and jewelry. Yeah, you can search it out and, test it out before you purchase it. And it ranges all the way to those products that are high in. Is everybody getting my picture? Or is it oh, seriously? You know what my picture? You know what my picture? You do? Yes or no?
Yes.
No. Okay. Okay, so we have that, right? Is that clear? So, and I don't know why you're taking pictures because it's in your textbook. But anyways, now, due mainly to the intangible nature of services, we recognize that there are some important aspects associated with it that deserve a very particular, deliberate, and specific treatment. And one of those important aspects is quality. So largely due to the intangible nature of products, we see how quality and assessment of quality becomes quite difficult. And for all of the characteristics that we just mentioned, an assessment of quality becomes quite challenging. And so therefore, we need to devote particular and special attention to quality within this domain. So therefore, when we look at quality here, we recognize that within a service domain, quality is captured, assessed, if you will, along 5 major dimensions or components, if you will, that you see listed on the page. And so the first one is reliability. When we use the word reliability in this context, we mean that we're looking at the accuracy of the service delivery, the consistency of the service delivery. So how accurately, how well is it delivered, right? How accurately, how valid, how consistently it is delivered. And that is assumed under this dimension that we call reliability. We also see that there is another term that we use, and that is assurance. And when we talk about assurance here, it speaks to the importance of the service provider in the provision of the service to the consumer. It speaks to the ability of the service provider to instill confidence in the customer. That's what assurance is. right? So it's about assurance that that service, will meet the requirements or something. Furthermore, we also recognize another aspect of service quality, and that is tangibles. And simply put, when we talk about tangibles, we are talking about those aspects of physical evidence, something that is tangible, right? So we talk about physical evidence, I think there was evidence. So that's what tangibles means here. And so why is that important, by the way? Why is that important? Another reason why tangible physical evidence is important is because, consumers will look to physical evidence to try to make sense of the service. In the absence of information due to intangibility, consumers will look to tangible indicators to try to make sense of it. Right? And that's what this is psychological thing. Furthermore, there's another very important point here to be made, and that is, due largely to intangibility, there is, and this is the company services, there is a higher perceived risk associated with services relative to goods. I've recently submitted several articles and papers to publication, and in virtually every one of my papers on the site report it's intangibility running in my work that there's higher risk and therefore the consumer doesn't see that. So higher risk, right? So that's important. And by the way, just getting back to that 4I framework, you see that 4I framework is very important and useful for us too, because what does it really do for us? It serves to differentiate services from goods, right, along those characteristics. So that is important here. So empathy, right? Empathy is another thing. Empathy, on the part of the service provider seems to, the ability to harmonize and sympathize with the perspective of the consumer. And that's an important. So empathy is critical here too. And the last important aspect here is what we call responsiveness. And again, responsiveness is about the speed at which the consumer will receive the benefits from that service purchase. And how responsive is the service provider to the demands of the consumer. So those, in sum, are key aspects associated with service quality. So those are the five major dimensions.
Like, can you come back on the empathy? Can you come back and repeat?
What?
The empathy, can you repeat it again? The empathy.
The empathy part.
Could you repeat?
What's he saying?
Empathy.
Empathy. Oh, okay. Yeah. So empathy is all about the ability of the service provider to be sensitive to the perspective of the customer, if you will.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's about you can also think of it this way. It's like the level of attention that the service provider will provide to the customer. Think of it that way too. The level of attention that they're to the customer. Any questions so far? Easy, right? So, when we recognize then that these are the major sort of dimensions of service, we can then ask ourselves, okay, well that's all kind of cool. How can we measure it? And the way that we think about measurement of quality is analogous in the same way as we think about conceptualizing and measuring satisfaction. And you should remember that whenever we talk about satisfaction, what's the first thing we always want to think about? Satisfaction. What is the theoretical perspective that we talk about? Whenever we talk about measuring satisfaction, what should we think about?
Benefits, values. Benefits over values.
Expectation on
Okay.
outcome. Expectation on outcome.
Yes,
Yeah.
expectation and outcome, right, absolutely right. And what do we call that? Expectation theory. Expectation theory, yeah, very good. So yeah, that's the framework that we use, right? That comparative framework, that outcome versus expectation framework helps us then, as I said over and over again, to assess satisfaction. Satisfaction, of course, being pretty good. Okay, my voice is getting tired. I'm gonna have to suffer with the people. Okay. It's amazingly loud, isn't it? Amazingly loud. Unacceptably loud, I think. But, okay, so when we go to measure quality, we recognize then that the way that we measure, conceptualize, and the overall impact on quality is essentially analogous in the same way as we treated satisfaction. And as we've just established rightfully, that the way that we treat satisfaction is that we use a comparative framework. We compare outcome to expectations. So we recognize that. We recognize here another key point here, and that is that, you know, in marketing, this is an overall thing in marketing, that if you get nothing from this course, please do voice this point of forward here. And that is the importance of expectations in the mind of the consumer. Expectations are critically important, and it really informs much of what we do. Expectations, right? Those anticipated outcomes that the consumer will have. So expectations are critically important. Anyway, getting back to this then, we realize then that in order to assess quality, we assess it in the same way as we talked about when we talked about satisfaction. So yes, we have essentially that service quality model, we'll see a picture of it momentarily, that seeks to really compare the outcome with the expectation. And it's the same thing, right? So if we have an outcome that exceeds an expectation, is that good? Big time good, because we have that positive disconfirmation, the expectation is being disconfirmed in a positive way. That's good, that's what we want. So I think that, you know, my haircut is gonna be okay, but in fact, expectation, but in fact, when I go in and get it done, the guy does a phenomenal job. What am I describing here? The outcome is greater than the expectations of what I'm describing. And so therefore, what does that lead to? High satisfaction, yes, but it leads to here, high perceived quality. Okay, so that's a key thing. And, you know, all the rest of the permutations here are the same, analogous to satisfaction, so I'm spending my repetition on that. So therefore, it becomes very important then to manage expectations. And as I told you before, let me ask you this again. I've asked it several times. True or false? What is the answer to this question? True or false? As marketers, we recognize the importance of expectations. Yes. So therefore, the question is true or false? We always want to raise expectations as high as possible. True or false?
Right.
Because if you raise it, then you need to meet it.
Or exceed it?
Exactly.
So yeah, you're quite right. So then the point is then is that, yeah, we need to be very, very deliberate and cautious about how we manage expectations. Because if we raise expectations too high, we might not be able to meet it or surpass it. So that is a critical thing. Right? So what does that mean? Generally, here's another little tidbit that, you know, if you graduate, you should think about moving forward. You know, in the business world, what's another little result and tidbit here that I could share with you? Have I told you how much I hate this system here? Have I told you that so far?
You guys say the game.
Okay, because you agree with me, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, what was the question I just asked?
You're about to ask.
Yeah, what was I about to ask?
As marketers.
Oh, yes, thank you. Okay, here's another little tidbit then. You know, of an essential tenet, which is quite true in business, is what do you want to do, generally speaking? You want to under-promise and over-deliver, right? It sounds somewhat trite to say it, but it is absolutely true, and it is, you know, based on and founded in a very sound psychological aspect, consumer psychological aspect. So, yeah, so that is true. So therefore, the whole notion then of managing expectations becomes critically important in this regard, right? And so that is key. And so we also recognize then that expectations are critically important. We need to manage them effectively. And also we recognize that experienced or perceived quality on the part of the consumer is very important too. And so there are a bunch of things that feed into that. I've already told you how to measure it in terms of 5 dimensions. But what feeds into it? How about something like the brand image, the image of you know, their expected functional quality, technical quality, and all these kind of things contribute to an overall experience sense of quality. So we look at this kind of relationship, and this is nothing new. I've said this over again. I've showed you this before, by the way. So I'm basically just repeating myself here. But essentially, this is just a graphical representation of what I have mentioned at least 3 or 4 or 5 times prior in the course here. And that is, here we're talking about that comparison between an outcome and the expectation. And so, you know, what feeds expectations? Experience, knowledge, expertise, marketing efforts, word of mouth, other appraisals, whatever consumers say. All these things feed into expectations, prior purchases, it all feeds into expectations. And so you compare that to what is experience, right? And so it's that functional, technical aspects of the outcome that sort of feed into an overall perception of quality. So that is key. Now, when we look at this delta, if you will, potential delta between outcome and expectation here, we realize some key things here. We realize that those deltas that in this context we call gaps, these are called gaps. These gaps can arise from a variety of sources. And we'll talk about those momentarily. But the point I'm just trying to convey to you is that, you know, when those deltas, if you will, exist between the outcome and the expectation, these here are called gaps in the provision of service, right? And so, yeah, like I said before, with you know, satisfaction, they can be positive disconfirmations or negative disconfirmations, right? So we realize that. However, here in services, in marketing overall, and especially say here in services, we are always highly attuned and highly cautious and weary of those negative disconfirmations, right? When, in other words, we as service providers fail to surpass the expectation of the consumer. When that happens, that's bad. We don't want that. That essentially represents a service failure. We don't want that. And so what does that mean? What does that mean? That means that we typically will have a dissatisfied customer. And when we have dissatisfied customers, they are more likely, and I said this over and over again, they are more likely to have happy customers. They are more likely, or moderately happy customers, they are more likely to engage in negative word of mouth, which will further damage our service. Right? So we want to try to avoid that at all costs because it is particularly troublesome. And why is that? And the reason why that occurs is that it is psychologically hardwired into us. And I mentioned this to you before, we talked about pricing, that whole very powerful notion of loss aversion. The notion then that, you know, as humans, it's hardwired into us to try to avoid losses. More specifically, we hate losses. Those losses are more painful to us, right, than positive things. Loss aversion, that psychological principle on which economic theory of cosmic theory is built. Right? We spoke about that before. So it is key. So we need to be very cognizant of that. And you will remember this is what we talked about, right? I drew it on the board. We talked all about it. I showed it to you on the slide. We had several discussions on this. We alluded to it during the first lecture, which you saw in the video. You know, so we've gone over this over and over again. So it's very good. And so, yeah, we recognize then that those gaps, as we refer to, can originate from numerous sources. You know, some of the potential gaps that we typically identify in service marketing are indicated here. And what do we have here? This is a short one. And so what do we see? We see here that there could be a gap between consumer expectations and management's perceptions. So the consumer will expect something, however, management, they perceive that it's okay, and in actual fact, it doesn't line up with expectations. That's a potential service failure gap here. So we have a gap there in that regard. We have a potential gap that could emerge from management's perceptions and the service quality specifications. So I think that I'm going to be able to deliver that pizza to you within half an hour, 30 minutes. You know, I think that I'm going to be able to do it, but in actual fact, I can't really do it. So there's a difference here between my perception and the spec of, say, 30 minutes.
Can you comment on service between management perception and service?
The first one is consumer expectations and management's perceptions. The second one is management perceptions and service quality specs. Yeah. And then the third one is a potential delta that could arise between that service quality specification and the actual delivery of the service. And which brings us to the fourth potential gap here, and that is a difference between the actual delivery of the service and external communications. So if I communicate out to my consumers that, guess what, I am going to deliver that pizza to you within 30 minutes, and I publicize that, and I have all kinds of built-in warranty and everything associated with that, or guarantee, I should say, associated with that, and I deliver it within 50 minutes. What is that? That is a delta. That is a service gap, and in this case, it's a service failure. So those are potential sources of gaps. Which brings us to, with more clarity, the notion then and the importance of measuring service quality. So when we seek to measure service quality, can we do it? Yes, we can. And so the way by which we measure it is that we tap into those and measure more specifically those 5 dimensions that we were talking about earlier. So those are the aspects that we seek to measure. Now, there's a commercially available, very frequently used survey instrument that is called ServQual, developed by researchers Zetamol et al. And that is a survey that you can basically purchase, tailor to your needs, and give out to your customers to fill out. And so here then you can get your customers to fill out a ServQual survey. And with that, it will tap into those 5 major dimensions that I referred to and measure it accordingly. So therefore you will have a sense of how well your service is performing in terms of overall quality. And so that's important. You always want to measure service quality. Which brings us to another important point here too, and that is when we talk about quality and potential quality improvements, the question then can be asked, is it possible to overspend on quality? Another important managerial question. Can you overspend on quality? And the answer is yeah, sure, you can overspend on anything, right? So the bottom line though is that in the same way as when we spoke about advertising expenditures, the way that we want to think about expenditures associated with service quality is that we want to conceptualize them as being an investment, not an expenditure per se. And as I've told you before, what is an expenditure? An expenditure is something that we purchase, but we don't expect to get anything back in return, right? That's an expenditure. When I buy a quart of milk, that's an expenditure. I don't get anything back on that, right? Whereas an investment, when I drop money into the GIC or a mutual fund, I typically will get something bigger back in return. That's an investment. So when we expend resources on service quality, we want to philosophically think of it as an investment, and that's an important thing. Furthermore, we realize that, in terms of quality improvement, we have to apply a judicious kind of approach to potential investments associated with that. And fundamentally, to help guide us, we should engage in some kind of a cost-benefit analysis, which will help us to determine the kinds of investments that we do vis-a-vis service quality. And so these kind of statements that I'm making here, these, you can take with you into any business context where service is key. But that's the kind of thinking that we want to bring to bear. So that is key. Now, this therefore brings us to, again, a recognition of our strategic thinking associated with service marketing. Now, when we talk about service marketing, I will again repeat the point that I made to you at the start, and that is that a fundamental challenge in service marketing is tangibilizing something that is fundamentally intangible. And so how can we do that? Well, one of the major ways by which we can do it is by, and I've said it 3 times so far, providing that physical evidence, providing those tangibles to the consumer. And that is a key way by which we can do it. So that notion that I've just imparted to you really informs everything that we do here. So yeah, we can use all of those examples that I gave you to provide that tangible evidence of service quality. And that is particularly important in services because strategically we recognize some key things. And that is that in many services, not all, but in many services, we see then that there are low barriers to entry. And now, at this point, since you're theory on the cusp of graduation here, as we near the end of the program, you should realize a key thing. When I use the word barrier to entry, what's the first thing that should pop into your mind? What's the first thing? What's the first framework? The most salient strategic framework that you should think about. I can't hear anything, all I hear is a mobile.
Focus,
Porter's 5 forces, exactly right, eh? Yeah. The work of Michael Porter, exactly. So that is a key thing. And so when we talk about barriers to entry, that is a fundamental thing, right? Barriers to entry, according to Or, so consistent with what he said, we can basically, repeat the same thing here. When we have low barriers to entry, what does that do? That has some potential substantial implications to us. If we have low barriers to entry, what can happen? Competition will come into the market. Competition will come into the industry. And if that happens, what happens? Competition increases. If there are more players in the sandbox, what happens there? It
Buyer
will
power
stimulate
increases.
greater switching behavior on the part of customers. That's a key concern. It'll also initiate possibly higher employee turnover. That's a problem too, right? All resulting in cost implication for us. So that is key. And by the way, when we talk about low barriers to entry, essentially in this context, what are we talking about? Here, we are capturing the notion then that many services that we're involved in, we can begin operation. In other words, we can provide that service without having our entire supporting infrastructure in place. So what does that mean? If I have a lawn care company, for example, do I need to have an office, and a website, and advertising? Do I need to have all that stuff in place? No. All I need is a lawn mower, and I can go out and do it, and a whippersnippers and basic, and I can just start doing it, right? Here's the point, so can my competitor. Right? So that is a key thing for many, many services, right? So that is a key concern here. So therefore, the question becomes then, how can we address that? How can we address that, right? And the marketing answer to that question comes in, well, we can address it by differentiating our service in the minds of the consumer. So we can differentiate ourselves in terms of what? In terms of quality. So we can provide high quality that competitors don't. So that's one way by which we can address it, right? By emphasizing one or several dimensions associated with service quality. That's a key way that we can do it. We can also, address it through some, aspect of the value chain, for example, So we can differentiate ourselves that way. So if we are, offering a lawn care company, we could provide some kind of a sales promo. We could, you subscribe to a year of my service to cut and prep your lawn. I'll give you a $50 certificate for Home Depot, for example, right? That's a means of differentiating my service from the competition. So it's that kind of thinking that we can bring to bear. So it is absolutely a key strategic challenge. However, we also recognize that for those high-end, more professional services, we realize that, the overall service quality, it really depends, especially on the employees here. It depends on the knowledge and the expertise of the employees, right? Quite obviously. So when you go in for open heart surgery, you want your cardiologist, to be the best qualified, most knowledgeable person, operating on, for example. So we realize that. We also recognize that, firm reputation and integrity are key aspects associated with, perceived quality, especially in those technical aspects. So that is key to recognize. And we also recognize leveraging all of the stuff that we spoke about when we talked about brands and the stuff that we talked about on CRM. We realize that these aspects are especially important here in the service context. So you see, again, here's yet another example. The stuff that we spoke about before is directly importable right into what we're talking about here. So everything we talked about there, absolutely critically important here in terms of brand building, customer relationship management, et cetera, et cetera. So as we drill into the three remaining keys here, and we look at service aspects associated with each of those three Ps, we recognize that when we start off talking about place or channels, we realize here that again, when we look at, channels of distribution, physical distribution per se doesn't really apply. We're not distributing something physically here, that we realize. However, we realize from our discussion on channels of distribution that channels of distribution and everything we talked about absolutely squarely applies to services, right? That was a specific point that we emphasized, right? So yeah, services absolutely are, have a huge role to play when we talk about channels of distribution, or let me rephrase it. Channels of distribution and establishing channels of distribution have a huge role to play in service marketing here. So it is key. And fundamentally, again, I get back to the same point, what really informs the overall structure of the channel of distribution that we might arrange, it's that intangibility that informs the overall structure. So therefore, the question becomes, great, it's an intangible aspect, it's a service, how do we get it into the, how do we connect the customer with the service? That's the underpinning notion. And so to answer that question, we say, okay, well, there are a variety of things that we can do. First of all, we can use the services of agents or brokers. That's one major way that we can do it, or two major ways that we can do it. We can use various contractual arrangements, such as franchises. That's a key way by which we can distribute services. And we talk about that when we talk about channels of distribution, franchises. So you look at H&R Block here in North America, for example. H&R Block, the tax preparation service, that is a franchise that is designed to distribute that particular service. So that's a key way. So yeah, and of course, we also have electronic channels, and we've spoken about that before, right? Electronic channels. When was the last time, I keep asking you this, when was the last time we went into a travel agent to make a hotel or a reservation or a vacation or a travel booking? When was the last time we did that? Like never, really, but you can remember absolutely, as I can, because I did it a couple of weeks ago, you can remember the last time that you went online and made an airline booking online, right? So therefore, electronic channels are particularly important in this domain. Furthermore, we can look at promotion, right? Promotion, i.e. here, especially that very specialized communicative effort that we call advertising. So here we recognize yet again the importance of communication as it relates especially to expectations on the part of the consumer. And so we recognize then that advertising and the way that we communicate with consumers is a major way by which we as marketers then establish and set and manage those expectations. So that is key. So again, we establish expectations. We absolutely cannot overpromise. We cannot make promises that we cannot keep. And so that is critically important. Furthermore, when we are communicating with consumers, and this even, strikes at the heart of even basic, mom and pop sole proprietorship operations here, especially. What are we trying to do here essentially in our, say, electronic communication with consumers on our websites and other forms of communication? We want to use vivid imagery. We want to use concrete words to communicate with consumers. Why? Because of that whole notion of intangibility. So we need to use those concrete words, those phrases and words that are concrete, not airy-fairy ideas or concepts. We need to use, concrete words You hire me to look after your lawn and you'll have the greenest, shortest, well-kept, lawn of the entire, neighborhood. Right? That's pretty concrete. Furthermore, I superimpose that with vivid imagery, vivid, colorful imagery. So I show you pictures and say, look, online, you hire me, this is the lush, green, short, lawn kind of garden that you can expect from me. That's vivid imagery. That's what I want to do, to overcome this nebulous, notion then of intangibility. So that is key. Furthermore, ultimately here, what are we trying to do? What are we trying to do here strategically? We are trying, and this informs how we communicate with consumers. We are trying to connect in the consumer's mind the product category with our brand. So we're trying to make our brand synonymous with the product category. That's what we're trying to do. So what does that mean then? What does that mean?
When the consumers think of a particular service, yes, we immediately think of the brand.
That's exactly it. So whenever the consumer thinks of, they're in, southwestern Ontario, they're in Windsor, Essex, for example, and they think of potentially hiring a lawn care, garden care company, me, to look after their lawns over the summer. What do I want through my advertising? I want them to immediately think of me and my service. That's what I'm striving to do in my advertising. And that's important. So we're trying to create that synonymous kind of thing in the consumer's mind. And how do we do that? Well, we make advertising very simple and we repeat it often. Generally. So those are key things. All about tangibilizing that service in the mind of the consumer. So therefore, yeah, all the things that we talked about, pricing can be leveraged and inserted right here and now. All the aspects we talked about, remember we talked about reference price becomes very important here. Reference price, that standard that exists in the mind of the consumer as to what they deem to be fair and appropriate, all that is upon here, right? Especially when we talk about pricing. So all the things we talked about when we talk about pricing can be leveraged and inserted essentially right here. So we also recognize then that in addition to reference price and all those other nuances that we talked about before, we realize then that, due to the intangible nature of services, I feel like a broken record always saying it, but it really is key. Because of that, it makes evaluation very difficult, and so therefore, like I had alluded to earlier, that the consumer will search for and attend to those pieces of information that's available to them in order to make assertions about the service quality. And if the only piece of evidence that is available to them is price, well, they will rely on price to make assertions about potential service quality. So that will inform their expectations, right? And so how would that work? Well, we realize, an underpinning pricing heuristic here that I spoke about before. Remember that word, heuristic? What is it?
Well, in relation to pricing, you said if the price is high, that consumers will think it's of higher quality.
Very good, absolutely right. Good, very good. Yeah. So heuristic is a mental shortcut, and as you rightfully said, that price-quality relationship is a very powerful heuristic, right? And again, just to repeat what you very nicely said, high price in the consumer's mind means high quality, right? And the reciprocal relationship. So we spoke all about that. So that is key. So that is the kind of thing that we want to remember. And so therefore, we also recognize again that, the role of technology is very important here in this regard. And essentially, the internet and electronic means like that has essentially become a channel for us in service marketing. In other words, it is a channel by which the consumer can be connected with the service. So it's changed the way that we deal with consumers here, largely the internet has. And so, yeah, we use it for travel bookings, financial investments, service delivery, et cetera, et cetera. So this is key. So therefore, I'm afraid I have some bad news here. Looks like we're going to finish early today. You mind? Is that okay?
Next close slide.
Sorry to disappoint you. I know that you would have liked to have gone on for another hour and a half. Is that okay? You don't mind too much, do you?
You don't mind.
I think we
You
said
don't mind too much?
Yeah.
Okay. You won't criticize me too much for that? Just a little bit, not too much. Okay, so anyway, we recognize then that we spoke about the importance of services. We need to understand what services are all about. We highlighted some important aspects. We especially recognize the importance of intangibility, and intangibility is a central feature that really informs everything we do in service marketing, the notion of intangibility. And it has implications. It has implications on how we market services, what services are all about, has a huge impact on assessment of quality. We talk about how we can assess quality within a service domain. And we ended off emphasizing yet again something that we all know, and that is that technology has a huge role to play. So with that in mind, we'll end off here. Wishing you all a very good evening.
That class last week. I haven't class.
Yeah. Oh, why not? Do not want one? Moses, do you not want one?
No, I'm done last week.
Oh, no, I think that's what you're saying. Yes, we do. We'll sum up. Next class, we will sum up. Next class, we will sum up.